I was born in a small farming town on the edge of Nebraska. There isn't much to say about the town that I'm sure you can't already surmise. For the most part, it has everything a family would need. A market, some shops peppered around the town center, a couple of gas stations. But aside from that, there isn't much else. Even though the town is somewhat simple, you'd understand how much more there is to it upon seeing the surrounding landscapes. Rows upon rows of carefully cultivated crops that seem to stretch on for miles in every direction. I'm sure for someone who hasn't grown up looking at such things would probably be impressed. I, on the other hand, hadn't really experienced anything outside of this town, so the charm was quickly lost on me. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate the town or anything like that. There just wasn't really much to do as a kid. While I did have some friends who I'd hang out with, most of my time was spent alone. You'd be surprised how far an imagination can carry a child even through the most monotonous of situations. Once I was around 10 years old, my mother started to become more lenient with me. She'd let me play outside more and more frequently. Eventually, I was able to spend all day outside, provided I finished all my homework first. Even though my mother's rules have waned with time, there was always one which she adamantly maintained. I was never to go near the Broken Oak Farm. Everyone knew about the Broken Oak Farm. Even as a small child, I was quickly made aware of its presence in the town as it was right next door to my house. The farm, as I was told by my parents, was the oldest farm in the area. It had been foreclosed upon a few years before my birth and had laid vacant ever since. The farm aptly got its name from a large oak tree that stood in the center of the farm itself. A towering oak which, according to rumors, was split down the center by a lightning strike many years ago. Whenever I'd ask about the farm, my parents were very tight-lipped about it. They'd always deflect my inquiries with things such as, "It requires a lot of work to get it back up and running," and comments about the market not being too good for purchasing farmland at the time. I remember asking my mother why I wasn't allowed near the farm, and she said that a lot of old equipment could still be around there and she didn't want me to get hurt. Being a kid, I didn't really have much reason to discount my parents' word. That was until I was playing one summer evening out near the road. I was around 12 years old at the time and was skirting the edge of the broken oak fence. I was imagining that I was a daring hero fighting off a bunch of bad guys as I darted and dashed along the dirt road. After dodging an imaginary sword, I spun around, and I saw it. There was someone standing in the darkened barn door of the Broken Oak Farm. It was a bit too far away, but from what I could see, it appeared to be a little boy, his outline drawn by the setting sun. I walked up to the disheveled fence, standing upon one of the rusted metal rungs, trying to get a better look. The boy's clothing was worn. He was wearing dark brown pants and a gray button-down shirt. I watched as the boy started to wave at me. I quickly looked around to make sure nobody was watching me. I looked back at the sun still lingering in the sky. I had to be home by sundown, so I figured I still had some time left. I wedged myself through the fence and into the field. I walked quickly but cautiously towards the old barn. As I approached it, I noticed that the boy was still standing there waving at me. But something was odd. He was waving extremely slowly, as if his body were stuck in molasses. This made me laugh as I thought he was just being silly. Once I was within around 20 feet of the barn, the boy seemed to fade into the darkness of the interior. I walked up to just outside the large wooden doors. It was then that I realized just how massive this barn truly was. The wood was very worn in places. Pieces of the roof had fallen in. The once vibrant red paint was now dulled and had mostly flaked away. I rested a hand on the door itself and the door seemed to groan in response. I called out to the inside of the barn. I introduced myself and asked the boy that I had seen what his name was. I didn't receive a response. Even though the sun was setting, the rays still managed to pierce the barn in places, and I could just barely see inside. I took a step inward and looked around. There wasn't much inside. A few pitchforks, some buckets scattered amongst the ground, and up against a wall was what looked to be a long-neglected tractor of sorts. The far back side of the barn was near impossible to see due to the approaching darkness. I called out once again, asking aloud where the boy went. Still, nothing. It was by that point that I noticed how strangely quiet it was inside this barn. There were no sounds of insects or animals whatsoever. The air felt still, even though you could clearly see outside through the multiple holes in the walls and roof. The sun was in its final throes of light, and I decided it was time to head home before my mother started getting upset. Just as I was about to leave, I heard the ruffling of hay nearby. I turned to look back, and in the far darkened corner of the barn were two eyes looking back at me. I remember thinking how strange it was that I couldn't see the rest of his body. I apologized to him and said that I needed to head home now. As I turned, I heard that same noise once again, only this time more intensely. I spun on my heels and I was now face to face with something. Its pale, hairless body hunched over my small frame. Fingers like razor blades hung in the air in front of it. Its head was completely smooth aside from a pair of large bulbous eyes staring into mine. Its hands came down to rest upon my shoulders. I could feel the pointed ends digging into my back. I could no longer hear my breath or feel my heartbeat. I watched with terror as the skin on its face began to crack and split. Like the ripping of fabric, a mouth began to take shape. A large, unhinged maw as black as a void was now in front of my face. With a croak, the thing began to speak.
I need to eat.
Once it was finished, it began to lower its mouth, almost completely engulfing my head. Suddenly, my senses snapped back to me and I realized what was about to happen. My mind could only seem to focus on my imaginary battle that I was previously having. In a quick motion, I jumped up with both feet in the air, and I kicked at the creature's chest as hard as I possibly could. I don't think it was expecting me to move like that, because as soon as my feet connected, it dropped me. With a heavy thud, I landed upon the ground, my breath knocked clean out of my chest. I rolled over and began crawling. Just before I was about to reach the cracked barn door, I felt something tug on my leg. I fought hard against the razor-like grasp and kicked repeatedly. My shoe finally came free and I tumbled outside. I sprinted my way down the narrow dirt path towards the fence. I didn't look behind me because I felt that if I had, that void-like mouth would be there to greet me. I jumped as high as I could and dove over the fence. Once outside the farm, I looked back, and there was no sign of that monster. I made it home not long after that, and my mom scolded me for being out so late. I told her that my shoe had gotten stuck in the mud and that's why it took me so long. Since that day, I never even thought about going back to Broken Oak Farm. Eventually, as I have gotten older, I learned that a child had gone missing near that farm, and that was the true reason most adults were wary about the place. Just before I was getting ready to head off to college, my family and I had found out that one of our neighbors, the Thompsons, had their son go missing. They passed flyers around with his image on them, and the police were called to investigate, though they seemed to unfortunately come up empty-handed. A few days later, as I was packing up my car to leave for college, I glanced over at the Broken Oak Farm. Standing in the barn door was a little boy. He was looking right at me and waving slowly. I was a fair distance away, but there was no mistaking the boy's bright red hoodie. The same exact one I had seen the boy wearing in the Thompsons' flyer. When I was 26, my friend and I decided we were going to sail around the world. Ambitious, yes. Stupid, yes. As I type this, I am 3.5 years into this journey, with an estimated 2 weeks until I reach home base. I'm not sure if I'm gonna make it. I'll try to sum up my life story thus far in 3 short sentences. I was lucky to have a nice family growing up, and we lived by the water and loved to sail. After college, I realized I wasn't very happy with myself and needed direction. I thought I'd find answers on the open water, or something like that. So my best friend and I set sail. Samuel and I had saved up a lot of money ever since we were teenagers. We bought a yacht together, aka a tattered 35-foot boat that was built in the 60s, with a nice motor and huge sails. It took some work to get it going again, but it was worth every penny. We had plenty of food. Clean water, water purifiers, medicine, flare guns, solar generators, batteries, a pro GPS. We had all the essentials. We also have a nice satellite thingy that Sam set up so we could have Wi-Fi on board. It only works about 10% of the time, truth be told, but if you're reading this, then I guess it worked. The past 3.5 years have been, interesting. Some weird stuff has happened, but I don't have time to type all that stuff out now. The only thing of importance now is surviving the situation I'm currently in, and creating this written record of what happened. It started a couple of hours ago. Like I said, I'm about 2 weeks away from California, where we started our journey, going north away from Mexico in the Pacific Ocean. A few hours ago, Sam and I were sitting on the boat's deck sipping some champagne, celebrating the fact that we were in the home stretch. The stars. My God, the stars were beautiful. You really can't get a better view of them than from the middle of the ocean. We were quietly admiring them. We had talked a lot in the past 3 years, but the silent moments we shared were the ones I remembered most. Like that moment we were currently in, silently watching the stars at night and sipping some bubbly. Or the very first morning we set sail. We didn't talk for almost 2 hours as we watched the sunrise. As it first appeared as a red blob climbing over the ocean's end, Sam was strumming "Here Comes the Sun" on his guitar. The salty wind was hitting our faces. I thought, this is it. No looking back. This is the beginning of this whole journey. I thought about these moments and more like them, but I was broken from my daze as I noticed Sam had stood up from his seat rather quickly and was staring off in the dark horizon. "What is it?" I asked him. "I thought I saw a flare." I looked out in the same direction he was and waited. A couple seconds passed. Then a skinny, barely visible streak of red appeared. It was a couple miles away, maybe more. Sam turned back to me. "Flare?" I nodded to him in confirmation. "Flare." "We have to go check it out," he said. "Way ahead of you." I ran over to the controls and started up the engine. We turned the vessel sharply and darted over in the direction it came from. We were traveling fast, for sure, but not at an unsafe speed. Our boat rocked up and down and side to side as we traversed the rough waves. Sam and I probably sailed for 10 minutes or so without seeing any more flares, and no sign of any other vessel in front of us. "Should we keep going?" Sam asked. "Just a little longer, I think." So we did, but this is where things took a turn. No, not a turn. A turn implies the driver is still on the road. No, things didn't take a turn. Things drove off a damn cliff. "Whoa, hold on!" Sam yelled back at me. I slowed down significantly. "What is it?" I said. I see something. I can't quite make it out," he replied. We continued at a slow, steady pace, keeping an eye out. I could see what he saw soon after he pointed it out, but I couldn't make it out either. A buoy, maybe? Some scrap from a ship? We approached closer. Wait. No. It's too skinny. Except on the top. It's a sign. It's a stop sign, Sam said aloud. It was about 10 feet higher than the water's surface. It stood perfectly still as the waves crashed around it. The octagon was red and weathered, and covered with rust. But the white letters reading stop in the middle were unmistakable. How was it not moving? It was almost as if its pole was stuck in the ocean's floor hundreds of feet below us. What the hell? I said. I don't know, man. Let's go back, Sam responded. I agreed because I didn't like whatever vibe a damn stop sign in the middle of the ocean was giving off. We turned, passed by the sign once more, and sailed away. We were silent again, but not like before when we were sipping champagne. We weren't thoughtful, reflecting, or anything like that. We were worried. We were scared. I could tell Sam was. And so was I. But why? It was just a stop sign, right? Nothing spooky about a sign. Just weird, odd, out of place. We continued on for a while, not speaking until I made a remark about the water. Wow, the water has really calmed down. These waves are nothing. Seriously, Sam confirmed. This is the quietest the water has been in months, maybe years. He was right. But a chill crept up my neck when I realized how quiet it truly was. It wasn't just quiet. It was growing quieter by the second. 20 minutes before, the waves were roaring and crashing into our boat, but they had weakened to small splashes. Then, that had diminished into the faintest sounds of water moving, like a small creak. But then it was silent. There were no ocean sounds at all. If any of you have been out on the ocean in the middle of the night, you know how dark the water is. It's basically black. The only definition of the waves comes from the moonlight, and you can faintly make out where the waves break and crash. Well, as the sound diminished, so too did the waves. The choppy black water had grown stiller and stiller. And now, it was motionless. It was just a still black surface. It looked like there was no ocean. There was no reflection from the moon or the stars anymore. There was nothing beneath our boat but darkness. Sam turned to me. He didn't have words, but his petrified expression confirmed that I wasn't going crazy. We both moved towards the side of the boat's deck and looked down, where the water should be. Looking straight down was an odd experience. You know when you look up in the sky and your eyes go to the furthest possible focal point they can? Well, this seemed to go beyond that point. There was nothing but darkness and I couldn't find an end to it. Sam grabbed my arm. What is this? What's happening? I don't know. I turned to him. But then I noticed something far worse. He was no longer backlit by the moon. There were no stars behind his darkened figure. The only light came from our boat's lamps. There were no stars. There was no moon. There was no water. There was only us and our boat. There was nothing beneath us, and nothing above us. The ship no longer rocked back and forth with the water's current. It was perfectly still, absolutely silent. We floated somewhere in space and time, I know that much. But I had lost all direction. I felt like I was losing my mind too. It felt like I had an out-of-body experience then. It was like I was a mile away from where I stood. I could see the small light emitting from the boat far off in the distance, and surrounding us was nothing. It looked like we were floating somewhere in outer space, a part of the universe void of any stars or light. I came back from that vision and gained some composure. What's the GPS say? I asked. Sam ran over to the navigation system's display. It says, his eyes were locked on the screen, He didn't finish his sentence. What? What does it say? It says... He paused again without looking up at me. It doesn't know where we are. That's impossible. You said the GPS works everywhere. It does. That gave me pause. What are you saying? He still looked at the screen. He ignored my question and asked one of his own. I'll never forget his words. Does it feel like we're falling to you? No. I started to say, but after he asked that, it did kind of. Before, it felt like we were floating on stagnant water in complete darkness, but now, I felt that drop in my stomach. My heart was beating faster. It felt like I was lighter, like my feet were barely putting any weight down on the deck's surface, like the boat was about to fall away and leave me behind, floating by myself in the dark. No, I reconfirmed, though I wasn't sure what I really believed. It could have been my imagination. I didn't want to accept the fact that we were falling. Falling into what? No, I said a third time. We aren't falling, it's just dark and it's messing with our senses. We looked off in the same direction. First towards where the horizon would have been, then down where the water should have been, then back up at the starless sky. We had nowhere to go. I wasn't sure if the motor would work or if the sails would be of any use. There was no wind and I was sure there was no water. We were sailing on an ocean of emptiness. What came next was something I had never experienced before, so I may have trouble explaining. That feeling that we were falling was gone. It had been replaced by a feeling that we were upside down. I don't really know how to describe it. At first we were upright, not falling anymore. But then we were turning. Flipping. It felt like the whole boat was capsizing. Turning over, very slowly. It kept turning over and then stopped once I felt like it was perfectly upside down. It was still completely dark. There had been no change in the scenery to indicate we had actually turned upside down. Nothing on the boat shifted at all. It was just a feeling. Like in outer space, there's no real up or down, but I'm sure an astronaut would be able to feel if they had been turned upside down. And I could tell Sam felt it too. He turned to me with eyes wider than I had ever seen. We didn't say a word to each other. Our locked eye contact was broken by a light above us. It appeared slowly, but it was obvious that it was stars. It was the stars and the moon in the sky once again. Oh, thank God, I said. But, as Sam and I looked upward, I realized we weren't actually looking at the sky. We were looking at a reflection of the sky. It had a slow, rhythmic motion refracting the light in a strange way. Then, I realized we were looking up at water. I looked overboard and saw that towards the bottom of the boat was the night sky. Beautiful and bright now, unmoving. And above us was the ocean, daunting and dark, but reflecting every star off its surface. We were upside down, or we were still upright and everything else had flipped. I turned to Sam, whose expression matched my own, one of shock and confusion. But the word confusion doesn't do the situation justice. It was beyond my ability of comprehending something like that as a human. He looked to me. His expression had turned to sorrow. He looked like he was about to burst into tears at any second. "Help," he whimpered. And with that one word, I watched my friend fly upwards, flail and scream for 10 agonizing seconds, then splash into the dark ocean above my head. He fell, I thought. He fell up or down into the sea. But I didn't fall. I looked up at the now rough waves and waited for my fate to be sealed, but nothing happened. Not yet. I ran into the cabin and began typing this out. I had come to the conclusion that I was going to die, somehow, and soon. I wanted my experience to be written out for someone to read, so someone knew what happened to us. I got about halfway through it before I heard the noise. It was a long, slow, loud, and deep rumble. It almost felt like an earthquake. It slowly grew louder and louder until I couldn't ignore the fact that something was happening. I peeked outside the cabin door, cautious not to go all the way outside. I looked up at the ocean, where I deduced the sound was coming from. The waves were larger now, rougher too. Those black waves would crash into one another and produce a light shower of white water. That's when I noticed how close it was now. The water was maybe 1,000 feet above the boat when Sam fell. Now it was more like 250, and that distance was decreasing fast. I stared at it, stuck in a state of confusion and fright. It was falling on me, or I was falling into it, and it was happening quickly. I ran into the cabin again for shelter, knowing it would be of little help. Seconds after I secured the cabin door, the ocean fell onto me, or I fell into it. The surface of the water crashed down hard onto the ship's deck, and quickly began flooding the cabin. I think the boat was fully submerged underwater for a second at least. I felt the pull from it as it brought itself back to the surface, trying to float. And I don't know how or why, but I knew I was upright after that. I'm not sure if the boat flipped itself or maybe a wave helped flip it over. It all happened so fast. I don't know, but I knew I was upright then, floating once again on the ocean. I got banged up pretty bad. Whiplash, bruises, a couple of cuts, possibly a concussion. My boat got the worst of it though. There's about a foot of standing water on the deck. The engine is completely wrecked, possibly beyond repair. The sails were torn to shreds from the impact of the water. But I'm floating. Upright. That's good. But I'm floating, wandering with no control over my direction on the ocean. And that's bad. And that's where my situation is now. I'm not sure what happened or where we went wrong. I'm not sure if I'll ever make it home. I'm not sure if anyone will ever actually read this. My GPS isn't working anymore. God knows where I am. I'm just hoping this internet thing Sam set up still works. God rest his soul. All I can do now is send up a few flares and hope someone rescues me. I just want to go home. But it's still so dark outside. I was only 11 years old when I first saw the man standing outside my window. It was a dark, stormy night. The onslaught of rain which battered our roof sounded like distant gunfire. I never liked the rain, so during this event I was curled up as far away from my bedroom window as possible. I gripped the blanket for protection as I found myself unable to sleep. I tried desperately to avert my eyes from the window. I thought if I didn't look for anything scary, then nothing scary would appear. With a bright flash followed by a tremendous boom, lightning and thunder shook my house. My eyes were drawn to the thin glass pane, and that's when I saw him. There was a man standing on the other side of the glass. I couldn't see what clothes he was wearing, not that I really cared considering how terrified I was. His face was mere inches away from the window. He was a middle-aged man, though I wasn't sure if he was even human in the first place. His eyes were so wide it looked painful. I thought they might pop out of his skull at any moment. Accompanying the large eyes upon his face was a strange, unsettling grin. Teeth, albeit normal, seemed to stretch endlessly from ear to ear. The man seemed to look around my room like a wild animal searching for its prey. After a few seconds, his eyes finally locked with mine. I thought he would try to open my window and attack me, but he didn't. He just stood outside in the rain and stared at me, never blinking. Another flash of lightning filled my room, followed once again by a massive crash of thunder. This sudden sensory overload snapped me from my fear, and I screamed as hard as I could. A minute or two later, I could see the light from the hallway underneath my door turn on. Shortly after that, my mother entered the room to check on me. She asked me what was wrong, and I could only seem to point towards the window. She returned a warm smile and brushed my face before standing up and walking over to it. I tried to crane my neck around her body to see if the man was still there, but he wasn't. She tried to console me and tell me that I was just having a nightmare, that whatever I saw outside wasn't real. She picked me up and put me back in bed, tucking me in before telling me goodnight. Even though I was still afraid, I thanked her for coming to check on me. Although I did feel quite a bit better, I couldn't fall asleep. I found myself looking over at the window every few minutes, expecting to see those huge eyes and enormous grin staring back at me. Eventually, the rain began to die down, and just as the sun was coming up, I drifted off. A week had passed since that night, and I was convinced it had been a nightmare, that my dream had somehow blended with reality, and I fabricated a scary person staring at me. Then, one night, same as before, I was lying in bed on the cusp of falling asleep when I saw the fluttering of shadows around my room. I glanced over and my eyes shot wide open. He was back. I could see him much better as it wasn't raining, and there was quite a bit of moonlight out. He was wearing a dark, tattered shirt that was torn in multiple places. His hair was matted and seemed to clump to his scalp. While he was standing there as motionless as ever, I called out for my mother once again, only this time not taking my eyes off the man outside. After a few minutes, my door opened, and I blinked. In that small amount of time, the man had vanished. My mother asked me what was wrong, and I told her that I thought I saw someone outside my window again. I could tell she was annoyed, but still, like a good mother, she went over to check anyway. This event seemed to happen every week or so. I'd be lying in bed, then I would glance over and see that face staring back at me. You would think one would get used to seeing something like that over time, but I didn't. I would always have a suffocating terror overcome me when I'd see him. Once high school rolled around, my parents hired a therapist for me to talk to. Dr. Shaw was nice enough, but she always seemed to want to discuss my home life and my friends, never wanting to bring up the man outside my window. She didn't seem to buy that everything aside from the terrifying events were completely normal. I think she had this suspicion that I was being abused or bullied, but that simply wasn't the case. My father did work a lot, but he never neglected me, and my mother has always been there for me. While I don't have very many friends, the ones I do have are kind enough. It took around half a year for Dr. Shaw to finally begin discussing the man with me. She was trying to find some correlation between this manifestation and my subconscious, but after determining that I had no issues aside from this one singular event, she was at a loss. She eventually prescribed me some medications, some to help me sleep and some antipsychotics to help make the man go away. I was skeptical at first. I had never taken any type of medications like these before, and I was convinced the man was real. During the first 2 weeks, the man showed up like clockwork, and when he did, I'd take a couple of my pills before slowly succumbing to my medically induced sleep. Then, on the 3rd week, the man didn't appear. The 4th week rolled by and he still wasn't there. An entire month passed, and nothing. It's difficult to describe how incredible this relief felt as it washed over me. I was finally free of this torment, and I could finally start having a normal life. During high school, I saw a noticeable improvement in my grades. I was making many new friends who seemed to truly enjoy my company. I was going out more, interacting with all kinds of people. It was as if my life did a complete 180. Although things were looking up and the days were much more enjoyable, I couldn't help but still feel a pit form in my stomach as the sun went down every night. Even though it had been multiple months since I last saw the man, I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that every night since then he would reappear. I would stay up every night, staring at my window from bed, and after around an hour or two, I'd take a sleeping pill and drift off. Life for me continued much like that from that point forward. I graduated high school and went off to college not long after that. Upon finishing college, I had gotten a pretty well-paying job in the city and chose to move into an apartment to be closer to my job, but also it was time for me to leave the nest. Things had been going great, and I had all but forgotten about my silent watcher. Then, last night something happened. I was sitting on my bed finishing up a few reports from work on my laptop. I had been mindlessly typing away, and before I knew it, the sun had already gone to sleep. I rubbed my eyes for a few moments, after having stared at my bright laptop for so long. When I dropped my hands from my eyes, I glanced over the top edge of my computer, and I could see my window. My eyes locked with another pair of eyes just on the other side of the glass. I froze and my hands halted above my keyboard. The man was outside my window again. I slowly closed my laptop and set it aside. I reached over to my nightstand without taking my eyes off him. After fumbling around for a few seconds, I found my meds and pulled them close to me. The man's grin only seemed to grow wider as he watched me carefully. I quickly uncapped the bottles and ingested a few of the pills. Then I waited, and nothing happened. The man didn't vanish. He just stood outside my window staring at me. I waited longer and still nothing changed. I was beginning to feel the effects of the sleeping pills I had taken when suddenly, I saw the man do something he had never done before. He lifted a hand, formed it into a fist, and began hitting my window. My slightly drowsy eyes shot open and I felt that familiar fear grip me. My breathing became shallow and rapid. A few short seconds later, the crash of broken glass filled my apartment. His arm reached in and unlatched the window before slowly starting to open it. As he did this, I shot up from my bed and ran out of my apartment as fast as I could. I ran down to my car and drove all the way back to my parents' house, asking them if I could crash there for the night. They both returned confused looks, but didn't pry, and welcomed me back inside. The next day, I went back to my apartment to see if it had all just been some crazy nightmare. However, the sound of crunching glass beneath my shoes as I entered my bedroom, and the warm breeze that wafted in, indicated otherwise. I grabbed my laptop and began writing this out because I don't know what else to do. The pills don't seem to be helping anymore, though I doubt they had been working in the first place. I have a million things running through my mind. Like, who is he? Why is he even targeting me? What does he want? If he's been real this entire time, then why did he disappear for years? But the biggest question that is grating on the inside of my mind is that if the man was real, then how was he able to stand outside my window on the 4th floor of my apartment? Like I've said, I've got many questions and I'm not sure what to do. I think I'll give Dr. Shaw a call and see if there's anything she can do to help me. In the meantime, if any of you see a man standing outside your window at night with a large grin on his face, then I hope you all have better luck than I did. My life is the definition of boring. Truth be told, this was never where I wanted my life to end up. When I was a kid, I remember looking up at the starry night sky and dreaming of becoming an astronaut. Even as a child, I wanted to go to outer space and achieve greatness. That ended up not panning out, obviously. With each passing year, new fads and desires began to sweep past me. One year, I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player, but I failed to make the team. The next, I wanted to be a world-famous rock star. I even asked my mother to buy me a guitar for my birthday. She bought it, and I played the thing only a handful of times. Once high school rolled around, I thought this would be it. This would be where my life would become great. I'd finally find my calling, so to speak, and the rest would be history. Sadly, that didn't happen either. I struggled my way through high school, and just barely passed most of my classes. I always thought it would be fine. I still had time. I could still do amazing things with my life, even if I never achieved greatness. I could travel the world. I could fall in love. I could go to college and get a degree in a fascinating field. Though none of those things came to pass. Before I could attempt to do any of those things, my mother got sick shortly after I graduated high school. She was unable to hold a job and pay her bills, so I decided to put my life on hold to help her out. While I didn't have a whole lot of skills, I was somewhat good with computers, and the job I ended up finding, a trained monkey could do with their eyes closed. I'm not trying to discredit the job in any way, or make myself sound much more astounding than I truly am, but if you did my job for a day, you'd understand. I got a job working for a large corporation, and for 8 hours a day, I sit in a cramped cubicle, looking at one number and typing it into a small little box. That's it. I'd be sent a list of numbers during my shift, then spend the entire day entering them one at a time. Like I said, trained monkey. Yes, the job was tedious and boring, but work was work. Not to mention the pay wasn't too bad either. It ended up being enough to help me cover the bills while my mom recovered. Now, I should say that I don't blame my mother in the slightest for affecting my life in that way. She has done nothing but support me in whatever I wanted to do, and I just thought this was my opportunity to repay her. So I did. Eventually she got better and started working again. However, by that point in my life, I had received a few pay raises during my time there, and had grown accustomed to working at this job. This ended up allowing me a bit of freedom as I was able to move out of my mother's house and find a place all on my own. To say that was a major highlight of my life would be an understatement. I had found a small single-bedroom apartment in the suburbs. The unit itself wasn't great, though it wasn't terrible either. It had everything I needed: a bedroom, bathroom, and a small kitchen. The only drawback was the location. It was quite a distance from my work, so I had to take the bus to work every morning, but aside from that, it was fine. Not long after I had moved into my apartment, I had fallen into an endless routine, it seemed. I would wake up every morning bright and early, shower, brush my teeth, make some coffee, then casually walk towards the end of my complex to the bus stop. I'd board and ride the bus for around 20 minutes, depending on traffic. The bus would stop about a half mile away from my work, and I'd disembark into the bustling morning sidewalk. I'd stroll to my office building, wave at the receptionist, enter the elevator, sit down at my cubicle, and begin my shift. That has been my life for the past 5 years. Then, about a month ago, something changed in my routine. I was leaving for work like I normally do, and when I exited the bus to walk the remaining distance to my office, I saw someone standing near one of the buildings ahead of me. He appeared to be a homeless person. Now, I've seen homeless people during my commute before, but this man seemed different. As I walked closer to him, he seemed to be talking to himself. Or if he was talking to other people, nobody seemed to pay him any mind. He was gesturing towards people as they passed by him, and he'd say a few words then turn to the next person. I quickly found myself growing ever closer to this odd man, and when I was within 10 feet of him, he ceased his gesturing. His head slowly turned in my direction. The way he moved to look at me didn't seem right, like he was in slow motion almost. His eyes locked with mine, and I could tell right off the bat that this man was blind. His white, glassy eyes locked with mine as I approached. I averted my gaze and quickly shuffled by him, though as I did, I could still feel his eyes burning holes into the side of my head. After passing by and getting a few feet away, I glanced back at him, and he was once again gesturing and talking at people. During my entire shift, I thought about that strange man, and how when I walked by him, it seemed like he and I were the only two people on the planet. After work, I worried that I would run into him once again on my way home, but as I walked to the bus stop, he was nowhere to be found. Until the next day when I was making my commute, I saw him once again, just the same as before. As I grew closer to him, he halted his over-exaggerated gesturing to stare at me. Each time this happened, I'd feel uneasiness build within me until I passed by. Even though I wanted my life to be exciting, this wasn't what I had in mind. A couple weeks passed by and I tried not to think about him. I even tried walking to work on the other side of the street one day, and as I did, I glanced over and saw him standing there on the other side, staring at me. This random occurrence was slowly taking its toll on my mind, and I could feel myself building to a breaking point. I decided that if I saw this man staring at me again, I was going to say something to him. Then, a little over a week ago, I saw him in the same spot he always stood. I was walking towards him, mentally preparing myself to give him a piece of my mind, when he stopped gesturing earlier than usual and turned towards me. Our eyes locked through the crowd, and I watched him lift his arm away from his body and point towards a random pedestrian. My eyes drifted over and I saw a businessman looking at his phone, not paying attention. He bumped into a person in front of him, and his foot slipped off the curb, causing him to tumble into the street. The squealing of tires and the screams of onlookers were the only things I heard. I didn't even need to see it to know what happened. Regardless, I couldn't stop staring at the blind man as he slowly lowered his arm. Police arrived on scene within minutes. I regained my composure and quickly rushed past the blind man so I could get to work. I spent a half hour in the office bathroom just trying to stop my hands from shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was just a freak accident, a coincidence, and focused on my work so I didn't have to think about the events of that morning. Then, 3 days ago, as I was walking to work, he stood there just like always. As I was about to pass by him and continue walking, something compelled me to stop. I stopped walking mere inches from the man and turned to him. The crowd was rapidly walking around us as if we weren't even there. I looked to the man and asked him, "Why are you staring at me?" He was silent for a few moments, his vacant eyes almost looking right through me. He lifted a weathered finger and motioned for me to come closer to him. I looked around cautiously and took a step towards him. With a raspy voice, he said, "I was curious." "Curious?" I asked. "My eyes can't see much, but I can see the end," he said. I returned a confused look and he continued, "Everyone has a fate. You saw the man who fell. That was his fate," the blind man said. "Then why do you keep staring at me every day?" I questioned. "I have watched many people. I have seen many fates. But yours is the darkest I have ever seen in my entire life." His voice seemed to trail off at the end. I could feel my heartbeat starting to hasten as I was beginning to process his words. Just as I was about to ask him what my fate was, or when it was even going to happen, a woman bumped into me as she walked in front of me. Just as I recovered my balance, I looked up and the blind man who was mere inches in front of my face was gone. I've been sitting at home for the past 3 days, too scared to even leave my bedroom. I have no idea if what the man said to me was the truth or not, but I can't help but believe him. There's so much I wish I would have done more with my life. I wish I would have chased my dreams. Any of them. From the very start. Now I doubt any of them will come true. It might already be too late for me. I have no way of knowing. But you all still have your lives ahead of you. So go out there and follow your dreams. Live your lives. Before it's too late. Before you end up just like me. I have been a park ranger for the better part of a decade. It's both a demanding job and one filled with enjoyment. I'm sure some people out there don't care too much about the great outdoors, but I do. I remember back when I was a kid, I'd spend countless summers begging my parents to take me camping at the park. My mother wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but my father would still take me even if she wasn't up to it. My dad and I would spend almost every summer out in the woods, hiking and fishing. It was the age-old cliche of father-son bonding, but I suppose it's a cliche for a reason, right? I never grew tired of it, even as I had gotten older. Eventually, I learned that you could make a living working in a place like this. At the time, I had very little concept of park rangers and what they did. To me, as a kid, I just thought they were police officers with funny hats. Don't tell anyone, but I still kind of think that. After high school, I went to college, and during my last 2 years, I was lucky enough to get a job interning at a park not too far from the school. I'd mostly do errands, but often the rangers would take me out on ride-alongs. We'd drive around in a pickup truck and just enjoy the scenery. Occasionally, they'd have to tell a couple of delinquents to hit the bricks, but other than that, it was smooth sailing. After finishing college, I applied to become a ranger myself, and was lucky enough to be selected. It's a highly competitive market, so being chosen was huge for me. My very first day on the job, I'll never forget it. Mostly because everyone I worked with never let me forget it. I was walking out of the ranger lookout. I guess I wasn't paying attention and I missed a step. I tumbled down the stairs, spilling my thermos of coffee all over me. I swear, the howls of laughter could be heard for miles. Aside from that unfortunate misstep, it's been an enjoyable ride to say the least. Over the course of my career, I've dealt with numerous events. The first major one that I can remember would have to be the time a group of kids had gotten a hold of some fireworks, which aren't permitted in the park. They had set a few of them off and we were called out to investigate. We arrived at the location not long after the report was made and luckily no damage was done to the park or the kids. We escorted them back and called their parents to come pick them up. One kid damn near wet his pants when I told him that I spoke with his mother. I couldn't blame him. She sounded like the wrath of God even when speaking to me. Other than that, there had been a few domestic disputes at the nearby campgrounds. Those happen relatively frequent as people often get stupid when they get drunk. So we either calm them down or ask them to leave. And since they don't want to pack up camp, they usually just go to sleep. The worst day was a couple years ago, when a local kid from a nearby town had gone missing. We were all called in to be a part of the search effort. Apparently, the boy had wandered into the woods and had gotten lost. We searched tirelessly for days, but in the end, was unsuccessful. I still remember his face on the flyer that his parents had made. That brings me to my scariest day working as a park ranger. I'm sure that's why you're all listening anyway. It was a slower day, in between spring break and summer vacation. During that time, there is typically a lull in the visitors, so our roster was somewhat spread out, not to mention we had a few retirees recently which left us pretty short-handed. I was stationed in the main ranger building at the entrance of the park, while Alan, another ranger, would be at the lookout further inward. After checking in and getting situated at the start of my shift, I watched out of one of the nearby windows as Alan hopped in one of the trucks and drove it to the lookout. I waited around 10 minutes before radioing him and telling him that one of his taillights was out. Another few minutes passed before he hopped on the radio and told me that he was halfway up the stairs, then had to head back down to check, and they were both fine apparently. I laughed through the receiver and I could hear him stifle a comeback. The day progressed and I did a few patrols in the morning just to take some time to enjoy my surroundings. The nearby lake was glistening with the morning sun. Along the trail I saw 2 hikers who returned a friendly wave as I drove by them. I stopped by the campgrounds to see if we had any new campers and was surprised to find it empty. Usually, regardless of time of year, there's at least one die-hard outdoors person staying here, but not this time. I didn't pay it much mind, after all it was less work for me. Once noon rolled around, a massive cloud seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't look to be storm clouds, but were thick enough to block out the sun's rays. I dreaded having to drive around in the rain, so I hoped the weather would hold up. Night was fast approaching as the overcast sun descended. I radioed to Alan to see if everything was fine, and he reported nothing out of the ordinary. The park after sunset was an eerily beautiful place. The stars that normally filled the night sky are a sight to behold, and the subtle sounds of the nocturnal forest coming to life is a sound I'll never forget. About an hour after sunset, Alan radioed me.
"John, you there?"
He asked. "What's up?" I replied. There was a pause for a few minutes before the radio crackled to life once again.
"Did you see any campers when you were doing your rounds earlier?"
Not that I could see. Why? I asked.
"I think I saw someone outside the tower."
Typically, after dark, the park is closed, unless you are a camper, so I understood the reasoning behind his question. Do you, want me to head up there?
"No, I think it might have just been a tree."
Well, let me know if you need anything, I responded, and the radio went silent. Another hour passed by and the radio once again crackled to life.
"Hello, John?"
Alan said. What's up? I replied once again.
"I need you to come out here."
He said. The way Alan spoke was strange to me. He sounded a little off. Maybe his nerves were getting the best of him, I thought. All right, I'll be out there in a minute, I said as I exited the ranger station and hopped into the truck. As I drove out to the lookout, I radioed Alan again to ask him if everything was all right, but the radio just crackled in response. I sighed, thinking he might be using the bathroom or something. Once there, I parked a few yards away from the tower's base. With a huff, I hopped out of the truck and turned on my flashlight. As I was approaching the stairs, my boot sloshed into the muddy ground. This caught me off guard, as even though there were clouds in the sky all day, it hadn't rained a single time. I lowered my light and saw the ground had a strange tint to the mud. What was weirder was that as I looked at it, I noticed that the muddy ground seemed to lead away from the tower. I followed it to the nearby tree line that surrounded the tower itself. In between two trees, I saw him. Alan. Or what was left of him. His body was eviscerated. His arms and legs had long gouges running up and down them. His face was completely torn to shreds. If not for his uniform, I doubt I would have recognized him. Just as I was standing over my bloodied coworker, the radio on my lapel crackled to life.
"Hello, John?
My breathing stopped.
Are you almost here?"
The voice coming through the radio was definitely Alan's, but that was impossible as I was currently staring at Alan's remains. I snapped my head and looked up to the tower above me. Even though it was dark outside, I could see someone inside of it. A silhouette, standing absolutely still through the glass. I radioed back. Alan? Are you in the tower?
Yes.
As soon as whoever it was responded, I made a dash to my truck. As I sprinted, I looked up and watched the figure run towards the tower's door and begin to descend the stairs. I barely managed to jump inside the truck before whatever it was reached the bottom. I quickly started the engine, and the headlights switched on. To this day, I'm still not sure what was standing in front of me. Its skin was gray from head to toe. Its body seemed oddly muscular, yet lanky at the same time. Long arms and legs protruded out from its torso. I could see the flesh expand and contract with each ragged breath it took. Its face was by far the strangest. Large eyes with enormous pupils sat in its skull. The lower half of its face was just a mesh of teeth, some even puncturing its own skin. It raised a long clawed hand to its mouth, and I could see it was holding something. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life.
Hello, John.
It said in Alan's voice. I floored my truck forward and plowed into the creature as hard as I could. The metal on the truck creaked for a moment before the thing fell to the ground. After that, I reversed out of there, spinning the truck around and driving until I was completely out of the park. The weeks that followed, I was interviewed by multiple law enforcement agencies about the events of that night. I tried my best to be honest, but hearing myself explain to the local police that it was a monster sounded absolutely insane. The authorities determined that it was a deranged individual who had attacked Alan, and when they went to apprehend him, he was nowhere to be found. It's been about a year since that day, and I have since moved 4 states away, getting a job at a smaller park. Some of you might think that's crazy, but I still do love the outdoors. I just refuse to work once the sun goes down. Thankfully, my new station is quite accommodating. I've tried to look up reports of similar incidents, and the closest thing I could find were myths about strange creatures called wendigos. I have no idea if that's what I saw that night or not. But here's some advice. If any of you are planning to visit one of your state parks this summer, I'd highly recommend it. However, if you're planning on camping at one overnight, please be very careful. And never trust a voice when you can't see its face. Some people experience very strange phenomena during their lives. Some might have a very bad string of deja vu. Others may just notice weird occurrences that seem to manifest out of nowhere. Some may actually experience oddities together, or know of people who have experienced it as well. I've always heard stories about random things happening to people, and I was always intrigued by the stories they'd share. My father actually told me an experience that he had when he was much younger. He was on a business trip, flying from LA to New York, and during his flight, the entire plane went dark. The plane began to descend rapidly, and after a few moments, the lights came back on and the flight resumed as normal. Might not seem very odd to some of you, but my father said that while this happened, everyone else in the plane didn't react at all. They just sat in their seats, reading books in the dark, having conversations amongst themselves, utterly oblivious to the situation. He told me he leaned over to the person next to him and asked if they had noticed anything strange. The passenger just looked at my dad like he was insane and turned away from him. Now, some of you may think my father is insane, or that he could have been asleep. I don't blame you. For most of my childhood, whenever he'd tell that story, I'd think the same thing. Then, something happened to me that I absolutely cannot explain. This incident actually happened to me twice. Once when I was a teenager, then again last night. I'll start by telling you about the first experience. After I was born, my parents moved around quite a lot. Like I mentioned previously, my father traveled quite extensively for work. We ended up settling down in a small town in Minnesota. Out of all the different states and cities I've lived in, I enjoyed Minnesota the most. There was just something peaceful about the town. My parents both worked regularly. As a result, I was left on my own quite often. This wasn't a big deal. I've been able to take care of myself for a long time now. My father still traveled frequently for work. He was some type of corporate supervisor and was requested to monitor branches of his company throughout the country. He was often gone for extended lengths of time. My mother, on the other hand, worked nights as a nurse. She worked very long hours. She'd leave in the mid-evening and then wouldn't come home until the early morning. The night that it happened, I was home alone as usual watching TV. I was maybe around 15 years old at the time and was currently on summer break from school. I was lounging there, watching some mindless cartoon, eating a bag of chips, when suddenly, the TV seemed to glitch out. It was like the reception was fading in and out for a bit. This continued for a few minutes before it returned to normal. Then, about 10 minutes later, all the power in my house cut out. I'll be honest, even as tough as I thought I was during that time, the power going out while I was home alone made me very nervous. I got up from the couch and walked over to the nearby window and glanced out of it. I was checking to see if it had been raining, to see if that caused the outage. It was completely dry outside. Dark, but dry. I figured it was probably time to head to bed. It had to be getting close to midnight. As I was returning to my room from the living room window, I glanced over and noticed that the TV was still on. I wondered how I hadn't noticed before. The screen was black but glitched with static every few seconds. I set the bag of chips down and looked at the screen a bit closer. After a few seconds, a loud tone echoed from the speakers. It was deafening. I found myself recoiling from the TV and covering my ears. The tone dissipated after a minute. Once I regained my senses, I looked back to the screen and noticed an emergency broadcast notice in black and white. The sound of a microphone being switched on could be heard, before a voice began to speak.
Attention. This is an emergency broadcast. We have been notified that something is threatening the security of the citizens. This is not a test. This is not a drill. Please keep your doors and windows secured, and under no circumstances are you to open them.
The screen cut out almost immediately after the voice stopped talking. I was left sitting there in silence for a few moments. That was strange all by itself, but a little less than 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. I'll tell you right now, hearing that after watching that broadcast sent my heart crashing to the floor. I walked over to my front door and looked through the eye hole. I couldn't see whoever it was that was knocking on the door. It was just a darkened chest in front of the eye hole. The reason I knew that it was a person was because I could see faint bits of light from the night sky, casting around the corners of this person's body. What was even more worrisome was that they only knocked 3 times, then just stood there, waiting. If I would have opened the door, the person would have been right in my face. I went and grabbed the kitchen phone to call my mom. This happened a bit before cell phones. But when I did, there was no dial tone through the receiver. I crept around to my bedroom, which had a pretty good line of sight from the front door to the window. Taking care not to trip, I made my way in there and peeked through the curtains. There were so many of them. There had to have been at least 15 people standing in various parts of my front lawn, the street, and near my front door. I watched wide-eyed as they all looked exactly the same. Just vague figures standing in the dark. I backed away from the window and quickly rushed to the bathroom, locking myself inside. My mother found me the next morning when she got home. I must have fallen asleep while I was hiding in there. She knocked on the door repeatedly, and at first, I thought one of them had gotten inside somehow. But after she announced herself, I cracked the door open just a little bit, and I saw her. I told her about everything, the people, the broadcast, but she just gave me an odd look and told me that the power hadn't gone out at all. I tried to convince her that I was telling the truth, but she led me to the kitchen and showed me that all the clocks were on and accurate, which wouldn't have been the case if the power truly had gone out. Since that night, I've thought about it often. I've tried to find other people who might have experienced it or something similar. Then, last night, it happened again. It had been numerous years and I had long since moved out and gotten my own place. I had gotten home after a particularly taxing day at work and slumped onto my couch. I had the weekend off, so I intended on catching up on all the shows I had missed during the week. Sadly, that didn't happen, as I dozed off shortly after laying down. I woke up to the loud signal tone emanating from my TV. Bleary-eyed, I looked at the screen and the voice once again came through. The man that spoke sounded exactly as he did all those years ago, but somehow more distressed. Just as I thought to retrieve my cell phone and record the strange broadcast, it ended. I got up from the couch and rubbed my eyes. I looked down at my phone and began to search for any strange occurrences on social media. None of my friends or relatives near me said anything. As I was in the middle of sending my 12th message to my coworker, a knock sounded on my front door. I froze. I could feel my hands beginning to tremble as I turned towards the door. My front door doesn't have an eye hole in it, but it does have a glass window near the top. I slowly walked over to the door and stood on my tiptoes to peek through the window. I could see them. All of them. There were hundreds this time, all standing at different intervals throughout my yard, driveway, street, neighbor's yard. They looked like black cardboard cutouts of people arranged all over the place. My eyes then drifted downward, and there was one standing a few centimeters away from my front door. If it had been any closer, it would have been inside my house. I got a decent look at it, and quickly realized that they weren't just shadows. It had a face, though its skin was varying shades of gray and black. Sunken, dull white eyes stared straight ahead, almost like it were in a trance. Before I could discern any more detail, the thing looked up at me, peeking through the window. When it did, I fell backwards onto my back. I ran to the bathroom, locked the door, and called the police. I didn't want to say monsters were outside, but I told them that I spotted some suspicious-looking individuals. After around 30 minutes, there was another knock on my door. I snuck out of the bathroom and walked over to the door, peeking through the window once again. The police were standing outside with their car parked in the street. I opened the door, only a sliver, and greeted them. They asked if I was the one that made the call, and I confirmed it. They told me they looked around, but there was no sign of anyone nearby. I thanked them for the help, and they left. Look, I know how all this sounds. Like the ramblings of a mentally ill person. Trust me, I know. All night I thought that might be the case. That there was something wrong with my brain and I desperately needed help. That was until this morning when I got up. I walked out into my living room and glanced over at my front door. There was a handprint on the glass above my door. It wasn't human. I don't know if any of you have experienced anything like this before or what, but I'm starting to worry that if this happens again, there will be more of them. And they won't simply knock on the door. Next time. My life has been as average can be. I grew up in the suburbs on the outskirts of a major metropolitan city. My parents were both hardworking individuals. My father was a construction worker. He was a burly man, somewhat intimidating in stature, but always had this air of warmth around him. My mother was a hairstylist, somewhat frantic in demeanor but still caring nonetheless. I was an only child, and my childhood was similar to, I'm sure, many other children. I would play outside frequently, make new friends, and go to school. As the years went by, I moved on from elementary school all the way to high school. I can't really speak for everyone, but during this time, I started to become more and more aware of my desire to leave home. I just wanted to begin my own life and live my own way, you know? Upon graduating high school, I had gotten a job as a mechanic in a small shop in the city. The pay wasn't too great, but work was work. And after looking around for a few months, I managed to find a place that was well within my budget. After contacting the place and making my way there, I was a bit taken aback by the exterior. The building itself was quite tall, with reddish-brown bricks making up the walls. Most of the windows that were visible from the street were blocked from the inside, yet most appeared to be worn and dirty. Dirt and grime seemed to be caked along the edge of the building's foundation. I walked up the stairs and entered the almost decaying-looking door. After a moment or two, I was greeted by a man in a rather nice but worn-looking suit. That seemed to be the only suit he's ever owned. The sleeves were frayed a bit, and the ends of his trousers had various stains, but overall it was presentable. Him and I spoke for a bit before taking me up to walk through the apartment he was renting out. We arrived on one of the higher floors and there were 3 doors available, 2 rather close to one another, then one a bit farther down. He gave a cracked smile to me as he gestured to one of the doors close to one another. He inserted a key, and after a few seconds, the scraping of wood on wood could be heard from the door opening inward. With a wave of his hand, he motioned for me to enter, which I did. At this point, I should mention that I wasn't sure what to expect. I was leaning towards some sort of hovel, a poverty-stricken nest for the downtrodden. As I stepped inside, I was quite surprised by what I found. The living room was freshly laid hardwood floor. I walked further in and the walls were clean with a fresh coat of paint. The windows, albeit smudged around the edges, were decent enough. I walked over towards the kitchen, which sported all brand new appliances. I was led down a small hallway to the bathroom, which was just as immaculate as the rest of the place. And I finally reached the bedroom. The bedroom was empty, but the walls were clean and the carpet seemed to be brand new as well. The only thing I could think of during this whole tour was that you really can't judge a book by its cover. After speaking with the manager for a few moments, I agreed to take it. We journeyed back down to the lobby into a small office and drew up the paperwork. I assumed the rent was so cheap due to the outward appearance of the building and the location. Regardless, I went along with it as I was satisfied with what I saw. Around a month later, I had managed to move all my stuff from my parents' house into my brand new apartment. The first few months of living there were completely uneventful. It was just an average apartment in an average city. Even though I came and went relatively frequently, I never saw anyone enter the neighboring apartments adjacent to mine. A little over a month ago is when I first heard an odd sound coming from the apartment next door. I had gotten home after a typical day at work and took a much-needed shower. Shortly after, I changed and lay down in bed, turning the TV on in the process. I watched TV for a little over an hour before hearing something coming from the wall directly behind my head. It sounded like a faint tapping. At first, I thought it was my TV making that noise, but after I shut off my TV to head to bed, the tapping sound persisted. I sighed, thinking that someone might have been doing some late-night home improvement, or it was possibly some sort of animal. I pulled my pillow over my head and went to sleep. The following night, the sound returned. I noticed that it started just as the sun was about to set. The sound was just faint enough that I'd still be able to fall asleep with no issue. The next night, however, the tapping started to become much louder. It was so loud that it was disrupting my ability to watch TV. I sighed heavily once again before rapping my fist off the wall a few times. After a moment, the tapping had stopped. For the remainder of the month, the tapping hadn't returned at all. My life continued normally until 2 nights ago. I was once again lying in bed, on the cusp of falling asleep, when I started to hear loud knocking coming from the other side of the wall. Hearing this caused my eyes to open wide, and with a huff, I returned a few aggressive knocks of my own. The knocking on the other side stopped for about 10 minutes, before once again resuming. I got out of bed and walked out into the hallway of the apartment complex. I groggily walked over to the nearby door and gave a few knocks. After waiting for a few moments, I could still faintly hear the sound of knocking coming from inside. I'm not really sure what compelled me to, but I found myself reaching for the doorknob. As I grabbed it and twisted, I found that the door was unlocked. With a soft creak, the door seemed to open into encapsulating darkness. I called out to the darkened interior, but no response was given. I peeked my head inside the doorway and looked around. The inside, from what I could see, was the same exact layout as my apartment, albeit mirrored. I took a few steps inside and once again called out, announcing my presence. I noticed that the apartment itself appeared to be vacant. There were no furniture in the living room or appliances in the kitchen at all. I could hear the knocking growing louder and louder as I rounded the corner down the hallway. After about a minute, I found myself standing outside the bedroom door. I could hear the knocking clearly on the other side. I reached for the doorknob and opened it. As the door opened, my eyes scanned around the room. It wasn't long before I saw the source of the knocking that had been disturbing me. It looked like a person with their back facing towards me. They had one arm raised and was knocking on the wall repeatedly, almost as if the wall were actually a door. The person was wearing a black hoodie of some kind as well as a black pair of pants. The two clothing items seemed to mesh in a way that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. With the low light, I couldn't really make out anything else. I called out to whoever it was, and as soon as I did, the knocking stopped. Then, as I was standing in the doorway, the person began to turn around. The face that I saw underneath that darkened hood was something I'll never forget. Most of the face was skull. Raw, exposed skull. It looked at me with hollow sockets, as what I could only describe as a black, slime-like substance dripped from within them. His body twitched and popped as he turned to face me. I felt my pulse begin to quicken, and before it could finish turning directly towards me, I took a step back and slammed the door shut. I turned and ran down the hall, through the apartment door, shutting it behind me. I made my way through my own door and deadbolted it once I was on the other side. I sat by my door the entire night. No knocks were heard. Today, I made a call down to the manager and he assured me that there were no tenants in the apartment directly next to mine. I told him that I saw somebody go into the apartment, a squatter or otherwise. He told me he'd investigate, but that I shouldn't worry. I thanked him and I haven't heard anything since. Well, not until after nightfall, that is. As I was sitting alone in my apartment, I started to hear that familiar knocking sound. However, this time, the sound wasn't coming from the wall behind me. It was coming from behind my closet door. I'm currently sitting in my car right now with my laptop writing this out because I'm not sure what else to do. I don't know what that thing is, where it came from, or why it's even knocking in the first place. If any of you out there have any ideas that could help me out, please let me know. For now, I think I'm going to call my parents and see if I could stay with them for a little while. At least until I can find a new place to live.